So, David, Beth, thanks once again for joining me on the Hermitix podcast. It's been 6 years.
It's a pleasure. It's been a long time.
So, we're here to, talk about and also talk around your book, The Black Pilgrimage, published by your own publishing company, Theion. And it's interesting because the last time we spoke, it ended up being about Cosmic Gnosis, which then, I don't fully. The history is fairly mysterious, but then we're sort of developing. There was a couple of essays dotted around, your current Cosmic Gnosis. And I think even in that chat, or maybe afterwards, you'd emailed me even back then to say that you were slowly working on this book. So we're sort of finally here. So what I want to begin with is, what is this? What is the Black Pilgrimage in relation to Cosmic Gnosis, and how has that current developed, in the interim?
Well, interesting enough, I remember the talk we've had, and I was thinking about writing a book, about the work I was doing at that time with the student I was interacting with. And however, I'd at the same time taken a type of you could say a kind of like a spiritual vow to not publish something for 10 years. The period started about like 2011, where I stepped down from a very prominent position in an esoteric occult order or current, you could say, to concentrate more on inner work and, a more intimate kind of work with advanced students. And so I was, deliberately trying to take a break from being a public person, which by then was very kind of prominent for me. And so I was toying around with these kind of ideas of writing something at some point, and as you said, I was writing a few essays and stuff like that. And we can talk a little bit later about like how this book came to be written. It was it was actually not planned at all. It was just kind of a spontaneous eruption triggered, by a talk I had given. And like we said, we just spoke about it before we recorded. I usually do impromptu talks, and that was the first time I didn't do an impromptu talk. So if you're interested in that, we can just speak about it a little later. So.
Well, we could speak about it now if you want to.
Oh yeah, well, I guess because it ties into it. So, I was invited to be one of the main speakers at the Berlin Occult Conference of Culture. It's called. It's very big, fringe philosophy, esotericism, art, music, whatever conference. Quite cool. And so, for the first time, I didn't just go there and basically have a topic in mind and then go on stage and kind of like whip something up and out, spontaneously. But this time I deliberately wanted to speak about death and how death and the dead relate to the living. And I wanted to use the symbol of the coffin as, the kickoff point. And I wanted to do a type of meditational presentation where you have a conceptual aspect, but also a very meditational, introspective experience. So I kind of created a script for that, and it's actually online. You can see it on YouTube. It's on YouTube. I guess they uploaded it at some point. And once I was done with that, I felt the audience had a really interesting experience with it. And a writer that I know who was also there, Peter Mark Adams, Theion Publishing, actually published his book on the Mithraic mysteries, which is very good. He's a scholar. He's a publisher. He's a practitioner and a scholar as well. So he told me like, "Hey, David, this was a very, very impressive and intense kind of experience I've had with your presentation. You should make this script available, in a brochure, or you have a publishing company, you should kind of prepare it and publish it." And I was like, "Yeah, that could be a good idea, if you guys." Really think that's kind of, something you would want. And so, I heard a lot of people speak about the talk and so on. I spoke to Jessica, who's my partner in Theion Publishing, the co-owner of Theion Publishing. And she said like, "Yeah, we can do that. And that would be great. Can you write a little introduction to it?" Or, just, I said, "Well, I can do that, like a little introduction or a little commentary to go with it. So it's a little thicker and we can do a little brochure, that looks proper." And I swear to God, man, I sat down and I started to write. And of course, I had over the years, I mean, even we already spoke about the work I was doing 6-7 years ago, and of course I have done this many more years before that. And so I had this massive amount, of course, of materials in all types of shapes and forms. And I just started writing. I was literally starting in the morning at 9 or 10, and I would stop at 3 o'clock at night, and before that, it wasn't possible for me. Even if I wanted to do this kind of, intense period of writing, I couldn't have done it. I'm a person, I'm not a writer in that sense. I have a strict discipline. I'm not a disciplined person in that sense. I have to write when I feel ready to do it. I have to be in the mood, and then it works and it doesn't work. So in this case, however, it was literally like an egregore of some type, a demonic power, if you will, the egregore of the current, or, however you want to explain it, literally overcame me in that sense and pushed me to write it. And it just flowed out of me, one chapter after another, just bam, bam, bam. And it was surprising to me, like, people had to stop me at 3 o'clock at night.
Was it the same when you think back to writing Vodou Gnosis?
Not like that.
Yeah.
That was, it was also quite effortless at that point. But I felt I was just in a good state of creative thinking. So it wasn't like that. And the stuff I tried, the stuff that I wrote about in Black Pilgrimage, is stuff I tried to allude to in a few essays I've written in the past, for various other books. I included some essays of mine in other people's books if they wanted them to be in it. And I always felt it very, very complicated to present complicated ideas and complex ideas in a very approachable way, which is not only conceptual, if you will, or logically understandable, but also very evocative at the same time, where you have an inner initiatic experience when you read it, while at the same time you find it quite lucid in the way it's explained. So to put this together before was a very, very huge effort for me. It took me a lot of effort to write even an essay of like 20 pages, So in that case, it was just literally flowing out of me. And it's something I've never experienced that way before.
So do you see this now as the sort of, it's tough to say or to call it a statement, because that's kind of stasis, which is relates back to something you said there about the difficulty of these complex ideas, because I think one element, at least in my understanding of Cosmic Gnosis, is nature doesn't stop moving, right? So the idea of these ideas, but do you see this as like the statement of Cosmic Gnosis now?
Well, for now, yes. I mean, there were, there was not really a pressure, but, I did also feel, of course, that some of my students, they were hoping, I mean, we have a initiatic group. It's an international group with people from all over the world, and we work together in very different ways, also with personal meetings and initiatic processes and stuff like that. And of course, we have a lot of teachings within that group, but never, a comprehensive, book like the Black Pilgrimage, which basically spills it out. So even my students were like, "Oh, that would be so great to have," even though we can access the material here or there in other shapes and forms. And some other people would approach me saying, like, now it became so popular to discover, in a sense, a type of more earth-based animist, neo-animist, polydemonic type of spirituality. And a lot of people who actually are now championing this kind of development clearly, I mean, very clearly, have taken a lot of stuff from my work. They've all, I know for a fact they have been reading my things. They've been listening to all the podcasts I've given, and I have been speaking about this and writing about this, I mean, for a long, long time.
Yeah.
But of course, while certain people do give credit, many people do not, as you know, from your own experience and work. So while it didn't faze me so much, because I was just doing what I'm doing and I don't really care what other people do, some people around me were a little bit irritated that was happening, and it's just like, yeah, no, it would be so great if you would do something. So would it be considered a definite statement? it's, as you said, we can't know. Maybe it's going to be, something else in the future. But for now, I think it's a very, very, very important and comprehensive glance into what the cosmic gnosis or the primordial way, or whatever you want to call it, looks like, and how the alchemical Gnostic path from one experience to another could look like. So for now, I think it actually encompasses some of the most important aspects that could be interesting to know for a wider public, while there are some more bits and pieces. For example, I could have added another pylon, which I may, however, publish as an individual little brochure. It's on heroism. What is heroism? I read a lot of like the hero, the Grail quest. It opens up a whole Pandora's box of like gender issues. What's the female and the male aspect? Is it? So there's a whole very interesting field right there, which within the Cosmic Gnosis takes on a very interesting and very different and unique character. So this is something it could have added as its own pylon, but haven't done so. Because I thought what was, like the collection of aspects that made it into Black Pilgrimage was enough to give a very good overview, and it, was complemented well by all the practices that are in there as well. So
it's interesting you speak about people's move towards animism or neo-animism, and I guess to be honest, a pandemonic, what you call a pandemonic world, which I might ask you to define, but this is something that seems like the historical moment of the occult is one where, at least I'm seeing this, and certain other people are seeing this, where, say, genres that were once a bit more boundaried are beginning to be open and blur into other genres. So you used to have sort of the Asian disciplines and non-duality, and that would just be bracketed off, that has its own telos that you go towards within that. You had, let's say, like the Krishnamurti Enlightenment, even, be here now type stuff in its own bracket, then animism, then magic, and then even, say, William Blake and vitalism. And people, I think it seemed that people used to stay within their own bounds, and there's a blending starting to happen where, let's say, even the conclusions of certain genres are beginning to become the conclusions of other genres. So people are almost using the techniques and tools of all these genres for the aims of other genres, but not necessarily in the chaos magic sense. People are still feeling treating the current with reverence and not just reducing it. Now, the Black Pilgrimage is a great example of this. I mean, you make this clear that you have pre-Socratics, vitalists, romantics, Vodou, and then, the non-being, non-dual aspects, or the nihil aspects of, non-duality. So it's a pretty robust foundation that you have. I mean, do you see a thread through all of that? Or, because it's a lot to balance, but you managed to do it.
I find what you said really interesting, because it's a trend I can see as well. But you are very kind when you evaluate it ultimately, and I think, however, it's because you're very kind.
In what sense?
Well, I'll let you know in a second. And because you're right. There used to be this kind of compartmentalized spiritual traditions and people keeping in their own field, you could say. But this kind of like pertained, in my opinion, more to very serious spiritual initiates, like people who went into Buddhism or in certain fields of Hinduism or Gnosticism and stuff like that. It didn't so much apply to the usual occult scene that I also was accustomed to. There you had a wild supermarket of religions already, from which people were, stitching together, their own little esoteric and occult worlds. And now I see a trend that goes in two directions, I think people are less and less interested in even having a slightly disciplined and formal environment in which they have to give any kind of how do you call it in English? Have any kind of responsibility towards anyone else in regards to their spirituality. Basically, it's my point of view, it's my experience, and nobody else can evaluate anything because it's my own thing. And it's this type of continuous insulation and fragmentalized individuality that I see that takes root also in the pursuit of spiritual disciplines, because we do no longer want to be reliant or I'm missing that English word which was come to me in a second. Responsibility, exactly. We do not want to relegate it to anyone else. So while you have that, which I find very problematic, because in the end it becomes that even more simplified supermarket of religions where everybody borrows from everyone, but nobody has a deep foundation from which they can actually start to borrow. For example, when you look at voodoo or any of the traditions which have some eclectic aspect to it, usually it comes from a deep understanding of, let's say, some type of initiatic transmission that you have become an expert in, and then you can start to borrow from other traditions which you may encounter, or you can include. So for example, in voodoo, I go to Haiti, and I could see obviously it's very famous. You can see of Christian saint figures and stuff like that, which represents voodoo spirits, but you can also see Hindu gods and in a voodoo temple, and rather than knowing that these people, or rather than thinking that these people have simply and cheaply basically appropriated other cultures' gods or stuff like that, they have seen, I don't know, a figure of a statue of Kali or another god or goddess, and recognized aspects of a voodoo god in it. And they basically put in their temple and integrated into their voodoo world. It's not then so much the Kali of the Hindu traditions, but the symbolism becomes completely voodoo in a sense, right? Mm. Or the way we talked about Christianity before, when we talked privately. So, for example, when an Orthodox Christian monk who is living on Mount Athos or something, and is very well versed in the Jesus prayer and all these meditational practices and stuff like that, encounters a Buddhist master and maybe studies with him in regards to meditational practices, he could probably take a meditational or breathing practice from Buddhism and integrate it into his spectrum of spiritual work within his own tradition. So these kind of borrowings, and of course, that there is no tradition, never have been in the entire history of the world, that was always untouched and never had outside influences. Mm. Every religious traditions, from the mystery cults to every other tradition, was influenced by outside factors and changed and transformed. The question just is, how elastic is a tradition? How alive is it that it can tolerate certain influences without losing its character and becoming distorted and becoming a dogmatic, empty shell that no longer transmits spiritual fire. So, so when I said you were very kind, is I'm seeing that main trend towards fragmentation, no longer the will or the discipline to enter one tradition deeply, and then maybe not staying like tunnel visioned or blindly focused on one tradition. Although if you're in the right tradition, there will be so much to do in it, and so much to learn, and so much to unfold, that you will probably not have time, like these marketplace spiritualists who just move from one tradition to another like grasshoppers. But I'm missing nowadays the ability of people to have a type of deeper calling and a type of dedication and devotion to a current or a praxis, initiatic practice, which takes time, which takes a seed to be planted and to grow and unfold in its own time. People have a very consumerist and a very mechanistic idea of spiritual enlightenment. That is why it's so easy to take all these spiritual traditions from the East and commodify them in America, especially, or in England and in Germany as well, of course. Right? I mean, it started with yoga. Now there's a yoga studio in every corner, in our streets. It's like Starbucks, right? And so it's the same with many other traditions. They become kind of, lifestyle enhancing, performance enhancing, gym type of training environments where you just kind of support your consumerist, mechanistic lifestyle, rather than being traditions which you initiatically pursue. So I'm really often missing, even in people who confess to a spiritual interest or lifestyle, that deeper need, even, that craving in the soul to devote yourself and dedicate yourself to a path, and then truly, understand that what unfolds is not a type of, a flash of excitement, like initiation is not, as some people may think, the next adrenaline kick, now, it's the demon's gonna pop up, or the god is gonna, appear in a flash of light or something, but it's this gradual unfolding of, or shifting of a position, of a perspective, a slow unraveling. And this is something that you are missing when you go into it with that preconceived notions. Heidegger, and I put this in the book as well, I have this, I learned this from Heidegger, the staying open towards what comes to you, right? Without expectations. It sounds simple, but it's very hard. As soon as you stay open with the idea, now I'm open, now I want something, because I'm staying so open, right? I want something exciting to go. You already kind of make ideas, what is, what's the due, what's your due, what is right for you to come. And so even that staying open in itself already frees you up. It's not actually what then comes or not, but it's that process of being open that already opens, you are also a student of Ludwig Klages, so what Alfred Schuler has called the open, or Rilke has then adopted in his work as the open. The open, I think, is that openness towards something which may or may not arrive. And it's an initiatic, not even process, it's an initiatic space which you can acquire. And that is something that is very subtle, and very powerful. But in our very fast, modern, commodified world, where also spirituality and initiatic ideas, are spoon-fed to people as something which is immediately available. If you read the right book, do the right practice, meet the right person, and they get disappointed when, unlike in the real world, right, in which they live, unlike the next dopamine kick from their mobile phone or from their reel or from their, Netflix show or whatever, it's less and less possible for people, especially in this fast times of easy dopamine, to focus on slow processes. And I see this even in myself. I see this in, I have a son. I see this in my son sometimes. How this generation, he's 15. How this generation is tormented in a sense, right, by this quick fix of being on a mobile phone and just scrolling through those reels and getting quick information, and being, often unable to have long, complex conversations, or, these kinds of processes are very difficult for them. And it's not really only their fault, obviously, because the world in which they live feeds into this in every aspect. At the same time, we have, of course, availability of so many informations, and we can see, of course, we get information from all different traditions. But things are available quite easily. And I think if you have the right perspective, the right attitude, then you could do and achieve what you have alluded to in a positive way. Rather than being corseted or shackled into a tunnel vision like our ancestors have, because they had to be Catholic or Anglican. Like in my case, it's Protestant and Catholic in my family. But of course, no longer this is necessary. We're open to pursue the things we can pursue, but it's a very fine line between pursuing it as a bored consumer and trying to fill our lives with meaning, and making this at best a philosophical learning process and a kind of intellectual exercise, or truly feeling called to be an initiate of some kind, an adept, an expert, you could say.
As you've this is initiation's clearly alive and very important for you and your work. What do you make of the I can't remember who actually said it, but what do you make of the statement, all initiation is self-initiation? Do you think there's any truth to that?
That again, it's very interesting you mentioned this, because if you understand it one way, I totally disagree. If you understand it another way, I would totally agree.
So it's about that responsibility and sincerity.
Right. So what I do not believe in, and it's a running gag between me and a few people, because I used to have that conversation. I think it was more than 20 years ago. I would discuss with someone, and he would literally say like, well, I don't believe in initiation. I don't believe in any teachers. I don't believe in this. I believe in there could be enlightenment on a potato field. So that would be so funny. So it stayed with me, and since then it's a running gag between me and many other people. So I do not believe so much in the enlightenment on the potato field, where it may happen 1 in a million, right? Master Eckhart or something could go in a potato field maybe and be enlightened in a flash, right? But I do not believe that self-initiation in the sense of if I just study enough, have the right attitude, and be open enough to initiation, the processes that are undergo in that self-analytical way, maybe you want to even call it, a lot of people use this psychoanalytical language for spiritual transformation, which I find very problematic, but people do it, and in the sense, when you hear, self-initiation is the only initiation that's actual, then it sounds to me like it's kind of a analytical process you undergo with yourself, and you hope that you dig deeper, and maybe in a Jungian sense or in a psychoanalytical sense, to a degree that's possible. But even the Jungians would probably say the mind and the self is so deceptive that if you do not have a psychoanalyst to help you out, you're probably gonna get lost in the labyrinth. And so I believe absolutely initiation, especially if you believe in something like relationality, right? The Black Pilgrimage makes a very strong point in explaining a world which is mechanistic and in which we live in our everyday lives, which is basically a world culled from a vitalistic, always flowing reality, and which is culled through our rational mental faculties into a world of replaceable objects. I mean, Heidegger talked about it, Clark talked about it in different ways. I talk about it from an initiatic, spiritual, occult perspective, you could say. And so if you believe, however, that the other world from which this is culled, our modern reality is culled, is a relational world where nothing is isolated, nothing is insulated, nothing exists that does not have basically selfhood that is not also other, then this idea of insulated self-initiation is misplaced, because it kind of like gives you the idea that you can be completely disconnected from anything.
Yep.
And initiation just comes from your inner self. And then you have some people say like, well, I've had this, I swear to God, I had this happen. People say like, well, my child is my initiator, my cat is my initiator, right? My friends are my initiators, because everyone I speak to, everyone I'm close to, gives me something to ponder. And to a degree, well, that's obviously true, right? I mean, if people around you and your cat and your dog wouldn't have any influence on you, it would be quite sad. But when people speak like this, to me, it already shows how shallow the idea of initiation has become. Because, just speaking now, for example, from my experience in Haitian Vodou, in which I have been initiated, the idea that you yourself could basically go through all the processes somehow by yourself and unfold as a priest in which you are related. And being a priest means also to be aligned to the spirits and to the powers that these spirits wield and the world in general unleashes in different ways and forms. You couldn't, on one hand, sustain it properly, and on the other hand, you couldn't make sense of it, and you couldn't put it in perspective and know how to deal with it. So the idea of relationality here would be, in the initiatic process, the initiator needs to open spaces in your metaphysical body, in your head, so the spirit can be placed properly, so it doesn't become a distorted experience. So basically things are placed within you. In the Gnostic tradition, it could be maybe considered to be a seed. An initiatic seed is being placed inside of you when you are prepared enough to become like a fertile soil, where the seed can actually take root. Of course, if you're not prepared, the initiation also may be applied, but then it wouldn't unfold because the soil is not fertile, but it may be just a rocky soil in which the seed just withers. So, in my opinion, when you understand the relationality of reality, the idea of isolated self-initiation becomes quite senseless, because you need, especially also when you think, to come back to that, when you think about, if you come from a deep tradition, right? This tradition has created an entire cosmos and cultus in which the relation of the individual to the community to the cosmos, the individual to the cosmos, has become a huge treasure house of images, of symbolism, and of relationships. And the practices and the inner meanings of these relationships, and these relations between the individual and the all, you could say, or the cosmos, is so subtle and so complicated and complex that if you think you can actually, by yourself, not only undergo these transformative processes, these alchemical processes, but also acquire that knowledge that maybe took hundreds of years or thousands of years even to be worked out, in order to traffic and deal with this relational web of experiences. And initiation teaches you to stand within the cosmos in a particular way, to become a certain knot of converging powers. And if you do not learn this properly, on the one hand, learn it, like, learn literal techniques and ways to unfold this world. But if you're not made ready by undergoing initiatic processes, I do not think you can ever reach at that deep level of initiation that higher initiates of real living traditions actually experience. And I'm not talking about, and the problem really is that in these Western esoteric orders, to which I have been exposed myself, I used to be member of various esoteric occult orders of Western prominence and so forth. The knowledge which they transport is limited, very limited. At best, it opens up a type of hermetic universe with lots of symbolism, maybe from the Hermetic tradition or from the Western appropriation of the Kabbalah and stuff like that, and you can work with that. No, that's not a problem. But the initiations are very sterile. It's very formalized. It does not take into consideration the entire community, the world in which we stand. So it just lacks so much of its of fundamental depth. Not to go even deeper into this, because otherwise we just get less in a rabbit hole. But it's so my perspective is that, in a positive sense, self-initiation must be the development of the seed that is placed within you. So if that aspect wouldn't work, any initiation is senseless. So, for example, I can be initiated, but if I don't do anything with it, the initiation doesn't really take root, right? In voodoo, for example, even if you're initiated into the priesthood, which already, of course, means prior learning and readiness and whatever preparations. However, the work really only starts at that point, because only at that point have you been enabled to establish a relationship with the spirits in a certain depth and to a certain degree that wasn't previously possible. Plus, you have an exposure. You stand within the cosmos in a different way than before. You shifted perspective and position. So if you would just stop there and not do anything, nothing of the priesthood, let's say, could unfold, right? You would just remain at the stage previous, and maybe even it would be negative, because the initiations that have opened you up in a certain way, now you're not doing anything with it. So suddenly, things would become very distorted. Demands would maybe placed before you by the cosmos, by the world, and you can't answer it the way you're supposed to, but you have been open up to it. So there could be a problem. So that is why in voodoo, in any living tradition that I know, I mean, I've lived in Brazil as well for many years, in which I've been initiated into local traditions there as well, Afro-Brazilian traditions, for example. So even there, it's the same thing. I mean, demands are placed before you, and when you are initiated to a certain higher or deeper degree, then you are accepting a mandate. You're accepting a kind of charge to do a certain type of job, to undergo certain kind of processes in the future years, in order to grow into your role and position, in order to stabilize it. So there is a period where you are very vulnerable to failure. So, these traditions have all this covered, and they take it, of course, really serious. So self-initiation here, in my opinion, means taking the gift or the initiatic seeds that have been provided and given to you and unfolding them to the best of your abilities. And it's also, of course, the responsibility of the initiator to vet you properly, to prepare you properly as a vessel. If they don't, and it's a genuine tradition, it can truly screw you over. I mean, it can really mess with you to a degree that's probably hard to imagine. So a lot of things come together, and funnily, in Western society, people don't really take this serious. It's like, well, that's just a little bit, superstitious, and how can that really be? But that's because we have been so divorced from these exposures to these kind of outer powers in the cosmos, that we no longer actually even experience them in that degree. So we are so insulated, and we just move in that kind of counterfeit world of shells and objects that the vitalist living world has a hard time intruding, but it still does intrude, right? We still have all times of anxieties, to lose all the stuff we've already achieved and already acquired. We have constant problems, fear of death. And so, of course, the cosmos constantly intrudes, and we try to build thicker and thicker armors and fortresses in order to shield us from it. Transhumanism is one of my favorites, escapisms, that I see floating around.
Well, I was just about to mention this, because the pylons, we could say, not necessarily the pylons of the book, but the pylons that the Cosmic Gnosis and Cosmos with a K in your vision gravitates around are death, the abyss, chaos, magna mater, eros, the sort of the pre or like Hesiod theogony, maternal chaos, these kind of things, and nature is always in flux. And it brings me to the only quote I've taken from the book, but it's from page 14. The cosmic vision is emphatically non-escapist. So Cosmic Gnosis doesn't see, it's completely fine or embedded within these things, sees itself as part of these things. So what you were talking about just there seems to me not necessarily spiritual bypassing in the normal way that's understood, but the bypassing of all the things we don't want to be, even if they're sometimes great. Eros is great, but it's also that can be uncomfortable for many people. So there's something in the sort of capital N nature of Cosmic Gnosis that is about acceptance of
Right.
those elements.
Right.
So what does this mean to be non-escapist?
I think you already alluded to it quite well. I mean, this is what you do so well. So it saves me it saves me the trouble. No, I mean, to be serious. So I mean, like you said, we have created a world where we believe that it is possible to become a self-serving subject which can shield itself from any kind of negativity, any kind of harm, any kind of things that are not pleasing. I mean, we see it, everyone does it in the small scale. Now we've just mentioned transhuman. Death was one of the big Western, fields which yet couldn't be tackled as, the threat to the sovereign self. So now, people are starting to try to find ways of even abolishing death because, it's that final threat to the supreme bloated Über-Ich, right? And so when I say that this kind of stance, and I can see it in the people who are not only regular people, but oftentimes also spiritual masters of, let's call it transcendental traditions, right? Which profess to have achieved a very detached level of self where they say the word doesn't really faze them and their material world doesn't really concern them and so forth. Well, if you look at their lives a little bit more closely and if you get into it a little bit more, you see that that's crumbling at the seams real fast when suddenly disaster strikes. I don't know, a child dies or a spouse dies or they have an accident. When everything is fine, it's easy to profess it, right? And even some people may be able to remain more detached while at the same time compassionate in a very detached way as well. But in the end, it's all a certain kind of escapism, is the, of course, subjective experience that the world is so flawed and not right. That, why does it have to be that there is death, there is injury, there is pain, there is inequality, and famine and people dying and stuff like that? And of course, for the subject, it's an irritating kind of situation from which we shield ourselves. And our entire life is devoted to this. And even the richest and most famous people are constantly. You would think if you're a billionaire, not even saying millionaire, be a billionaire. And then they see they're alcoholics, they are full of anxiety, they're always afraid that somebody's taking their money or that their influence is not strong enough or that they want to have more influence. You would think, like, you have billions of dollars, you should be really content and living this amazing life. But you can see they're oftentimes even more stressed out about things than we are, because then they set their goals to other things, and it's never so. A certain type of inner peace and contentness, is that the correct English word? I fail to see it very often. So fear and anxiety still prevails in most people. So this, however, is just due to the positioning you have in the world. You stand in the world in a certain way, right? As the isolated sovereign subject, that does its best to shield itself from all the negativity that you feel is unfair and that you're not part of, right? Because you kind of feel like an exile, you feel like an alien in the world, right? Because the world is flawed, the world is not conscious in a way that you are, and so you feel that you really don't belong. And then, of course, we have all these Gnostic systems and systems from antiquity to today, which teaches, well, that's true, you're actually not from here, you're from out there somewhere, from a transcendental place. And then you have all these fantastic theories on how this really is and what you need to do to realize it. So smart philosophers like the late Heidegger and Klages and others, and myself in my initiatory work, as Westerners in other traditions, like I mentioned voodoo, this is already the case. So the idea is foreign, that there is a perfect out there, a perfect place of consciousness or whatever you want to call, that we can relate to, that is not material, that is not physical, that's not embodied, that's not enfleshed, that exists somewhere to which we can somehow align or plug in so that we can become immune to these shifting tides of destiny or fate, which may impact ourselves badly. So non-escapist means to learn to shift your experience, to shift your gravity of experience from this subjective I, from this ruling tyrannical self to another type of center that exists within yourself. Let's call it the soul, or let's call it a knot where powers converge and interact and stuff like that, and then unfold a very unique experience of the world from that position. So when you manage to move away and out, not abolish, right? We don't want to abolish intellect or something, but if you manage to move out of that control fetishizing center of the self towards and realize yourself as a web of relations, which is possible, then you suddenly stand within the cosmos in a different way. Then suddenly, tragedy, misfortune provides also opportunity, and it can be explained. It can be basically you become like a flexible web where blows can be absorbed in a different way. You're not a rigid, insulated, wall against which things hammer and at one point will break. But you become a flexible web in which these types of experiences are integrated in an entire web of experiences, which are experienced from a different position than you had before, where these things become integral aspects of the world and how it moves, and with yourself in it. So it sounds a little bit theoretical, but that would be then, of course, the philosophers like Klages and Heidegger have tried to explain it philosophically, and we actually, of course, try to embody it spiritually by initiatic processes. So in my opinion, non-escapist means a certain kind of amor fati, right? A certain type of acceptance of the world as being filled with fortunes and misfortunes, however, also because you have become so open, the insulation has broken open, and only by its being broken open and by being by understanding how relational you are, you can actually change things. You can actually change things through initiation, through maybe manipulating certain webs or certain strands that come in and out. This is the idea in living traditions that I'm exposed to, right? They see the personhood of a person not as the monad which needs to know itself most perfectly in order to be most supreme and most superior, but they view the personhood as a puzzle of many, many pieces who also constantly are partly exchanged. So, you have an ancestral aspect, you have this aspect, you have a spiritual, you have an aspect of a star, of this, of that. So the personhood is considered to be a unique configuration of many different powers which have meaning in the world, and which then, if something is problematic or you need to change something in your life, you can actually manipulate within that web of meanings and correspondences and take something out and place something in, weaken something, empower something. But that only works, of course, if you have that sense of personhood as plural and not as a unique unit that is enclosed within itself. So
with this unit, I mean, there's one thing I want to mention, but there's so much I want to get in a sense. But one thing I want to mention there is, do you see an element of sort of almost apophatic, like via negativa occultism with regards to this? So you're taking this tense individual lump of personhood and it's being reduced, and in that reduction it's not the sense of Christian apophatics where you throw away anything that is known because God can't be known, but actually what is reduced at the bottom is nature. You're back to things that are usually aestheticized, as I've already mentioned, in a negative sense. So you're reduced down to, say, realization of your flesh, realization of death, realization that you are connected to your ancestors. So this kind of reduction to those things, and instead of as per usual with negativa or negative theology, God being at the bottom or a mystery, there is almost a mystery, but it's a enthusing mystery that is related to nature. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. Interesting as well, and it's complex. In some ways, yes and no. I mean, like you said, it's definitely not the via negativa of traditional theology or something, but it is a kind of stripping away. That's true. It's a kind of stripping away of layers which insulate you to the vital currents of the world, you could say, and which also displaces you from that overpowering sense of that isolated subjective me that is, something, however, you share interesting, you think that's so unique, that's the most unique thing about you. It's not, because everybody else shares it too, right? That's the interesting part. So however, it's basically stripping away some of these defense mechanisms in order for you not to basically be reduced to zero or to like just a nothingness where, I guess in the via negativa, God can fill you, or I guess the mystery can fill you, or the unsayable can fill you. But where you realize that you are unique, not because you have what everybody else has too, that sense of me, which, like, you're also a fan of Nietzsche, like me, where Nietzsche, the sense of me disappears, right? Nietzsche was lucid in one moment, and then, at the end of his life, he thought he was Napoleon. So sense of me, is that the real is the real me of Nietzsche Napoleon? And he was sure he was Napoleon, or is the sense of Nietzsche, the Nietzsche that he was, like, I don't know, 20 years earlier. So the reductionism or the stripping away just leads to the realization let's put it like this: it leads to displacement. It leads to displacement where you realize yourself as a unique configuration. So that is also not something where there is nothing, but there is a lot, right? It's a configuration of powers which collide and come together in your unique experience, and that nobody else can have. So the unfolding of a world that takes place in this moment or through you is so entirely unique, that nobody else can. And this is interesting also for spiritual experience in general. Like, while you are disciplined within maybe a tradition, the unfolding of the world that takes place is unique to you. That is why, for example, unlike in Western esoteric traditions, you cannot really compare yourself to your brothers who are moving ahead in the degree system and stuff like that. Oh, he does this, he learned that, I learned that. Because really very quickly you learn that your life is so unique, and the unfolding of life that you are, because basically what you are is an unfolding, right? An unfolding of a world, because the world unfolds through you, through this unique, conglomerate of influences that, however, could not be someone else, but are you. And a type of reflective consciousness is part of it. So, there is a reductionism or a negative theology there, but only if, it only, however, goes a certain way, until that displacement, the shift happens from the tyrannical eye, let's say, from the spirit eye to the demonic eye, in the sense of a daimon, right? Where you realize yourself in a different way. And I recently have become a little bit more interested again in Bataille and people like that. Of course, I'm no specialist at all, but amateurishly interested, because he, in his Acephale work, which is the only stuff I'm really interested in is Eros work. But you know, he understood that process where you had to literally cut off, you know, the head of the tyrannical self, or the Uber Ich, the Godhead, right? So he was interested in Nietzsche too for that reason, in order to awake something which always extends beyond yourself as I, right? And this is something that I'm interested in. This is the process in a nutshell. And even if I completely misinterpret Bataille, this is what I get out of it in a positive way. This is what I'm aiming at. You know, the not only rational, and this is important, not only the philosophical, rational, intellectual understanding maybe of a concept, but the actual embodiment of it in spiritual experience, or in ontological experience. So of course, you know, a lot of people can profess, oh well, you know, I read Heidegger, I read Klages, I read Bataille, I read this and that, but you know, in the end, it may sound all great. Like most occultists, you know, they read a lot of books, and you know, it sounds all great in their head, and so they fashion a world in their head where they are like, I don't know, great conjurers of angelic or demonic powers, and they become a little bit of like LARPers. But in the end, for me, as a initiate or as a spiritual practitioner, is all about the practices, all about the embodiment of these teachings. These teachings to me are absolutely meaningless if they remain theoretical only. At least to me personally. I hope, you know, it inspires a lot of interesting philosophers, but for me as an initiate, it must have practical value, where the experience of displacement, the experience of extending beyond yourself, and I know some people practice, I mean, Bataille, I think, did too, Klages as well, Jünger as well, they practice, you know, with, of course, drugs and all types of ways to break down that, you know, confining brain that torments you in your sense of selfhood and sense of who you are. But I believe that this is possible even without the help of drugs. And if you use them, again, it has to be basically integrated into a very complex and deep spiritual practice. I mean, I lived in Brazil, as I told you before, and you know, ayahuasca was super popular in the West. It's becoming super popular in the West when I lived there, and I've been exposed to initiates of these ayahuasca churches there, and that's a weird. They have different strands of ayahuasca practice. Some more shamanistic, like, you know, Amazonian shamanistic. Some is this weird fusion of Christianity and drugs, and ayahuasca is like singing hymns to Mary and Jesus and moving around the central pillar while having visions of Mary and stuff like that. It's really interesting. However, this spiritual tourism, the belief of taking, you know, psychedelic drugs, for example, and through this having a shortcut method to initiation, just because at that point you feel more connectivity to the cosmos, or you break through your confinements and stuff like that. However, then go back to your normal self, where maybe you have a cosmology which you stitch together from Max Weber's Supermarket of Religion, right? And hoping that you can integrate it by yourself into that. And often then it becomes wishful thinking, right? Because what we do create, that we create a world we think is just for us, is good for us, in a moral framework that we like, in, you know, ethos that we create, and it's nothing, you know, that really is anything else but a world which we want to create for ourselves to feel good within. You know, it's not a world we accept as real and then we orientate ourselves, right?
Well, that sort of ties back to this negativa approach, sort of the displacement down to becoming a vessel for whatever vital forces may wish to flow through one. And this is a place where I want to, you know, draw on the word pandemonic because it's so important for Cosmic Gnosis. But what do daemons look like within this current? Because is this directly influenced by, well, not influenced by Klages, but Klages, you know, harks back to this understanding where once it was that, you know, every river would have a daemon, every tree, every forest, etc. So this sort of opening, this ability to be vulnerable, of course, means that daemons and that vital energy of daemons can flow through one. But what role do daemons play for you in your work?
Yeah. So of course, what we are not interested in, nor I do believe it possible, to basically strip yourself down to a place where you're just becoming a passive, kind of mute freak, where you're just being overcome constantly by, I don't know, vitalistic powers, and you're basically a weird puppet. That would be being as much of a puppet of a puppeteer. This would be the puppeteer. The world would be the puppeteer, and you would just be kind of like, a transmission stations of weird powers that constantly possess you in one way or another. So this is not the case. However, I do agree with Klages that the world is filled with enthusing atmospheres. So to me, a daemon would be also an atmosphere. Something that can enthuse you in some sort of way. So even in ancient Greek, history, you had like, a nymph for every pond, or you would have like a, there was a spirit in every river, and so forth. So I believe that this type of world in Africa, that's the same thing, right? Everything is quite, or could be, let's put it this way, everything could be populated by an enthusing power, and not everything is always enthused at all times, right? So, but everything may become a vessel of something enthusing, or it itself can become enthusing. So, what I'm aiming at is to understand yourself as relational and always extending beyond yourself. However, understanding that you have a core as, however, not a static thing, but it's a kind of an opening. It's an opening which, however, is configured in a certain way. And we could conjure what we just said before. It's a certain configuration of, and here, of course, we just need to find ways to explain it, like, or ways to communicate it. It could be ancestral aspects. It could be aspects of a star, a certain kind of knotting, which provides a type of foundation, which then serves as that type of opening through which other powers may come and go and influence and so forth. So my aim is to be able to open yourself up to the enthusing atmospheres of the world and respond to these atmospheres accordingly. So the response to such a intrusion is a cultus, right? So, for example, also, some of these influences or atmospheres are too subtle to even, of course, realize, right? I mean, a little mosquito that floats, I don't know, 3 kilometers away from me, it's not something I will notice, or I will not notice, a certain gust of wind or something. So the idea, however, is also that some things that are enthusing are more important or prominent in someone's life. So, for example, if I would live as a people at the seaside, the gods of the water, and anything to do with water, maybe, or with storms and other things, would be something that enthuses me very strongly, for many reasons. So I guess, I would, you would find in their cultures a very strong sense of, or you find gods of water or gods of the storm very prominent in their world. Because that's something that enthuses them very strongly, and the response must be accordingly. And the people who live in the desert may have, of course, not gods of the ocean or of some sort, but maybe gods of rain and other things which are important to them. So in every environment, and that is why the environment is so important as well. So everything plays a role. Everything, within which you live and stand, and the people around you, everything creates a kind of atmosphere collectively, but also individually and separately.
Well, one thing I'm interested in that I want to just ask you about, though, is this kind of history of daemons, where nature is concerned, or even archaic buildings or archaic institutions, I think we have what we might argue is a collective unconscious, if you want to use those terms, innate understanding of those daemons. So the feeling of a river, the feeling of a forest, even the feeling of a castle, because it's had such time to grow roots. Yeah. What would you say about daemons of the cosmos, daemons of a motorway? Is this, daemons of a skyscraper, daemons of a city? Are these bastardizations? Where do they come from? Is there such a thing?
Yes, I would say there is such a thing. I think Ludwig Klages calls them phantoms, right? So if we want to, bring him up, he would consider, so as far as I know and as far as I remember, and I find it quite intriguing, he would consider these kind of because they are also enthusing to a degree, right? I mean, I think he painted that picture of the Chicago in the 1920s or in the 1900s, early 1900s, where there was like polluted river, just smoking factories and basically dead country. Basically trying to conjure up a complete horror vision of the modern world. So that kind of enthusing quality that these kind of deformations, in a sense, would produce for Klages, I think, have. You could call them probably the demons or the daemons of the countercosmos, like you just did, because they reinforce, I guess, the world in which they have been produced. But since the production of such a world is artificial, because it is the world that these horror scenarios are being realized within, is a world that is produced out of this kind of reductionist, mechanical culling, you could say. So the enthusing qualities of it are correspondingly problematic in the sense that they reinforce this kind of trauma on the individual. However, I kind of hesitate to be too radical about this. I also believe sometimes, I mean, I lived in London, I lived in very big cities, and in certain moments, these cities also have a certain glamour. It's a kind of, strange glamour, but I do not want to go back to this kind of pastoral harmony. Klages sometimes, even though he was emphatically, denying it, would sometimes, in my opinion, go back too much into this, harmonious, Pelasgian, pastoral, Arcadian, Eden, like Edenic state. Even though he tried to mediate this, but I could see that movement at times, right? But so I think we have to acknowledge that there is a certain glamour and a certain power that these phantoms, you would, if you want to call it that, exercise. I mean, I just brought up the mobile phone and my son's generation's addiction to reels and to quick information and to fast dopamine rushes. So these are atmospheres too, right? They have influence, and however, I believe we have to differentiate what furthers life, vital life, and what blocks it, and what kind of hinders its transmission and its flow. And it's not easy probably to do, but I would shy away from this radical rejection of the modern world, or the modern achievements, or stuff like that.
Well, one thing I would bring in off the back of that really interests me about your work generally is that the term aesthetic has been watered down. So people, or the way aesthetic is spoken about, seems to be basically what people mean by appearance, very two-dimensional. And one thing I think your work always has an emphasis on is aesthetic as a grammar that has a depth. And it time and time again within the Black Pilgrimage, you're mentioning, smoke, ember, fire, blood. And so do you see that as sort of, I don't know, some sort of that aesthetic as a liminal in between? It's something that is almost frightening to the countercosmos, something about that aesthetic. But but what I want to emphasize is you're someone who takes aesthetic very seriously.
Definitely. I believe, like, you're absolutely right. I think aesthetics now have become this kind of shallow phrase, oh yeah, like his aesthetics.
Mhm.
But to me, aesthetics is, for lack of a better word, I mean, I was sometimes, of course, my English is good, but sometimes, I do struggle with explaining some of the more complex matters. However, the aesthetics sometimes, in its deeper meaning, for me, is also the quality of the image, the quality of the daemon, the quality of the atmosphere itself. So through the aesthetics, we can enter the deeper experience of that which the aesthetics is about. So when we conjure an image of smoke and ember, a funeral pyre that blazes at night against a starry night sky. So conjuring up these aesthetic images, why I do this is I hope that doing it in a certain way, in a ritualistic way, nearly, you could say, by trying to accomplish this goal, is to seduce people who are open enough to allow it to happen into an experience. Because I deliberately employ them in places where I want people to move beyond the purely conceptual understanding of what I'm trying to convey, but try to have a first inkling of what it feels like to be sucked or seduced into that space. Like Alfred Schuller would probably call it erotic suitors, which seduce people into the experience. He used that term in regards to oral recitations or when he gave a talk. But the same thing is true, in my opinion, for creating a language, however, which is not just randomly flowery. I sometimes take issues with certain occultists, which are quite popular, for using this very flowery Victorian English language and being very poetic. But for me, it just becomes kind of a masturbatory.
Who are you referring to?
People like Chumbley and stuff like that. Andrew Chumbley, who has his merits. I do like some of his stuff. He's a very smart man, or he used to be a very smart man. He's dead already. But he was very much into using that aesthetic language.
Mm-hmm.
I think he may have had that original idea as well of trying to use that language in order to basically hypnotize people into a certain state. But I think in his work and some other people's work, it became self-serving, right?
Yeah.
It became a masturbatory show-off of, poetic language or of complex language. And I try to walk a kind of a tightrope between remaining clear, not being too wordy in that kind of self-masturbatory, stringing together fancy sounding or exciting sounding words, but deliberately creating thresholds, aesthetic thresholds, which kind of exercise a certain demonic allure, you could say, right? That then if you are approaching this book with that certain openness, not with a preconceived idea of what you want to find in it, because on the one hand, maybe it's like, I'm skeptical, about this kind of stuff, or, I'm really into this, aesthetic language and this, I know David, he does, all this intense stuff. So, that's what you expect. And then you will find it, I guess, but if you remain open to the seductions and the thresholds that on various levels I've tried to incorporate into it, then it should work as this kind of living demonic. So the book then becomes more than just, like, let's say, interesting conceptual, philosophical, occult treatise. It becomes kind of a living talismanic symbol, an image in itself that in its various places, may suck you deeper into an experience, and then you may just come out of it like, holy shit, And however, of course, it needs the right person. It needs someone like you, maybe, or a few other people who, can, are prepared. Like we said in initiatic contexts, right? You need to be prepared to a certain degree. If you go at a book like this, or if you go into the late Heidegger, I mean, there are many scholars say the late Heidegger was a nutter, right?
Mm-hmm.
The early Heidegger of Zeit und Sein and stuff like this is amazing. But the later Heidegger of the Fourfold, is kind of a mystic weirdo.
Most
And
because it becomes embodied, right? Academics don't want to leave the faculty lounge.
There you go. And he didn't give them that kind of lifeline, which where they could spend their concepts, to his later mystical, musings. And so, so if it needs that neutral, open stance in order to experience some of these thresholds. And if you can continue with this, you will have it many different times over, depending on where you're at in your life. You can go back to such a book and, have read it and understood it conceptually clearly, the first time or the second time, but you can go back to it because it has these thresholds. It has these aesthetic trapdoors, which, depending on your current status quo, and your openness and your readiness and your ability to connect to these aesthetic demonic seductions, will have a different effect on you. I've had this experience with Ludwig Klage's work, for example.
But I think as a testament to the cosmic current, just as you were saying, it will suck you deeper. And I was looking at a note that I had of Abyssus Abyssum Invocat. There was a massive lightning strike and thundercrack outside for the first time in about 6 months. So now I feel obliged to ask about deep calls to deep as we move into this depth. Abyssus Abyssum Invocat, which seems to be the bridge in the book between, because I should say the book is split pretty much half and half. I don't want to say theory. Let's say prose. Enthusing feeling about the current and then into practice. But this deep calls to deep seems to be the bridge. If we were to just spend some time on, I guess, what that means and what this looks like as a practice. Because to describe it fully as a practice is kind of, we were struggling with this like the whole way through. I think of this isn't conceptual. So all these concepts in practice get blown out anyway. So yeah.
So the concept, and I think this ties into what you spoke about in the beginning. Like, how much is that basically, a collection of different deeper currents that have come together in that maybe even demonic aesthetic presentation. So the thing is, the way I borrow certain concepts from Heidegger or Klages, and however, of course, a Heidegger purist, or a Klagesian purist would not recognize much of the concepts in my work as purely Klagesian or Heideggerian. I have been inspired, let's say, by these thinkers in a way that allowed me to kidnap some of their concepts and charge them in a certain way, so I could carry across something I needed to communicate in order to make this intelligible to an audience who is maybe more learned in Western terminology. It would be a different book if I would write it for Haitians or for a lost tribe in the Amazon, if I could write their language. Or if they could read their language. So the conceptual aspect of it is just the attempt to circle around. It's like a ritual dance around the mystery. The mystery is something that will always, of course, refuse that kind of conceptual packaging, right? So every concept that's introduced, I've tried to introduce it in a way that's so non-dogmatic in a sense that it's considered an experience as a pointer, one more pointer towards what I actually allude to, which will always withdraw in Heideggerian terms. It will always withdraw from that torch, which we use to kind of try to shine a light on it. So, because I do not want to, rip away the veil of Isis or to shine a light on the mystery, because I think it needs to retain its mysterious essence for it to work on the initiate or on the people. My conceptual approach is using concepts that I feel Western people will understand quite easily if they have a certain approach and of course a certain level of learning, I guess, but if you stay with it, you'll get it. It explains itself. But it is all fed by initiatory currents I have been exposed to. So I have been exposed to different kind of transmissions, Western, Afrocentric, you could say, and others. And at some point, Gnostic, right? I'm a Gnostic bishop or apostolic bishop, but consider myself a Gnostic. So, so all these things have given me different experiences of how the world is, and what can and needs to be done in order to, undergo the process, which I believe a cosmic Gnostic must undergo in order to achieve what he needs to achieve, right? So I think it is unique in the sense, and I'll come to the question in a second, but it needs to be said in order to understand what I mean. So I think the uniqueness of this current really is, it's on the one hand, it's the understanding of where we're at in the modern world. Let's say we are in the Heidegger's in framing, right? We are in the Gestell. We are in a world that's abstract, that's made out of abstract thinking, that's mechanical, that is a world of objects, replaceable objects, and so forth. Insulation will get worse and gets you're deeper embedded in these kinds of insulations, while at the same time you're given the illusion that everything is open, like you said before. Oh, all the traditions are on the table, everything is open, and you have the idea like, oh great, I can learn everything, I can do everything, I can freely move around everything. But actually this will embed you just deeper, because you're not doing anything coherent. Everything you're doing is creating a feel-good personal gnosis in order to conform it to your perceived needs, or your aesthetic, or your in the shallow way aesthetic or moral framework. You embed it in the moral framework that you have. So back in the days, the necromancers or the demonologists, they conjured demons into a triangle and it treated them real bad. Well, no, that's a colonial attitude. That's not good, right? I think demons should be treated not as slaves and servants and should be castigated. They should be as friends. So now we're talking to them as friends. Oh, I ask, the most horrible, prince of hell to, I approach him as my buddy. And so these kind of infantile approaches, they're actually happening everywhere, right? And they can only happen because obviously these people have never really connected to these types of infernal powers, and infernal in the sense of so raw, brutal. And like we said before, in the pandemonic world, nothing is perfect in that moral, ethical sense that some people may have. And of course, morals here, ethics here differ from ethics or morals there. So everybody has their own. That's why their holy wars and shit, So in the end, where we're at is basically so now I think I lost a little bit.
Practice. Going through the practice.
So basically the conceptual level is one thing, just to explain that mystery, and the initiatic qualities that show the uniqueness of the current is, on one hand, the realization that there needs to be a Gnostic alchemy taking place, a Gnostic alchemy from let's call it a fallen state, to use Gnostic language, the Gestell, the mechanized, rationalistic world, imposed upon us by our tyrannical subjective self. And there is another world that we can achieve, in a sense, right? And it's not a world that's separate, it's the same world, but a world, which is underlying the world that we have created from it.
Mhm.
So in the Afrocentric traditions, for example, that have been initiated, or in these primordial traditions, you could say, the Gnostic aspect is missing. So these traditions are still working. They have adapted, of course, to modern times in one form or another, but they have not established an understanding of, well, we are in a place that's not organic to who we are, because we know we have created a counterfeit world. So they're still operating within a cultic framework and a religious framework, which would be organic to a more primordial biocentric world experience. And that creates a huge conflict to them. You can see in Africa, people are rational university professors in their daily lives. However, they are still completely exposed to the more demonic, pandemonic experiences of, their tribal alliances and ancestral aspects. So, people are really torn between two worlds, and they have no tools in order to understand what's going on. And to do anything about it, really. So that's why you see in these countries also a lot of chaos. And the same is in our world. We may understand that something is wrong in the world, but we do not know which other world we could move into.
Yeah.
We're failing to have a proper understanding of what that primordial world in its phenomenal reality is like. And I think Heidegger, the late Heidegger and Klages, were two people who have attempted to push into this territory, into this terrain, right? Without any of that ideological or idealism, which usually is cast upon it. But they try to really step back and just look at what is, right? Rather than creating any a priori from which to interpret it. So here, these two things come together and provide a process and cultic experience on how to interact and realize yourself within a primordial environment, but at the same time realize and understand a Gnostic issue, which we first have to realize and then move and transform alchemically, basically, within us in order to move into this primordial experience. So these things come together in a very unique way, and that is why I think the Cosmic Gnosis is a very, very unique presentation, away from any of these, idealist ideas of, I choose to be a neo-animist. However, I remain completely logocentric in my thinking. However, I adopt, a more nature-orientated spirituality, but still, the gods remain the gods I want them to be, because, I don't want Hecate to be a fierce goddess that I have to sacrifice a dog to, or, I want the demons to be benevolent friends. So basically, you choose a certain environment that suits your aesthetic and your moral and your ethical logocentric values.
Mm-hmm.
So basically devaluing the other and the outside, because you project your own wishes and ideas and idealisms on it, and no longer find it, however, in transcendental spiritualities, because it's patriarchal, it's blah, blah, blah. And now you find it in this more nature-orientated, more hippie-esque, spirituality that is more en vogue right now. And you see, the logocentric problem stays the same, right? It's all a projection of what you think is right, what you think is morally correct. It reflects current ethics and current woke or whatever idealisms, and you can see it, of course, in the other corner as well, right? Incels and hyper masculine movements which believe that men have become weak, and we need to adopt again a more solar, powerful, virile kind of spirituality. And it's all smoke screens, and the laughing third is the spirit who puppeteers us out of this world and into some kind of fantasy worlds who are competing with each other. So the practical part of how to do this, and this is the crucial thing, is beyond all of these concepts which one has to understand to a degree, is initiatic guidance, initiations itself. So basically there are practices which you do in order to weaken the insulating layers of yourself. You have a community of people that you can basically, in a cultic way, establish a certain cosmic relationship with, in which these different kind of responses to a pandemonic cosmos can be enacted in practice within a larger community, because obviously we're never isolated people. We need a community in order to exist, right? Even the exile, the hermit in the forest, or the hermit in the cave, who says, he's so away from human society, he's just with God, and he's completely unconcerned with human society and totally detached, of course, is the most determined by it, because he is there and he is staying away, always in anxiety that someone will intrude, because there is that society. So that link that made him escape, that made him the hermit, that made him escape, is basically, the strong attachment that he has, right? So if we think about these things, it's wonderfully clear how these things unfold. So practices that you do under the tuition of elders, but basically a lot of things you do on your own. Then there are initiations at certain levels, which however are not degree initiations like you have them in Masonry or in these Western orders, but basically initiations which always place you deeper in a relationship, in a horizontal relationship with the cosmos, in a sense, right? So they're not designed to elevate you on some ladder towards more dematerialized life, but they embed you always deeper and in a different position in the all, in the cosmos. So these two forms, practices that you need to do, a slow development of a cultus that you develop, and spiritual guidance by a initiator, are three pillars with which you slowly and gradually move forward. And what is important to note here in regards to the practices is that the practices in the book, for example, you can follow all these practices verbatim, and I think even you should at a certain point, because they're very nice, and they're, at least you don't have to do all of them, of course, but you can integrate them in your daily work. But when you really look at it, what they actually provide is a ritual grammar, a skeleton, a way in which rituals are designed in order to work. They provide basically a spiritual technology, to use a mechanistic term in that sense, right? But here it's a different way of technology, right? So that's the most important part of the learning, because in the end, like we have established before, the way you stand in the world, the way you unfold world is totally unique. And my spiritual practice and my cultic practice can never be the same as yours, or a student of mine in Brazil or in America. So, however, the type of response, the cultic framework is exact and is immediately recognizable to me. When I see a student of mine or a colleague of mine in Croatia or in America do certain rituals, or show me his cultic practice. I mean, there are things we all do, right? Which are the same, because these are rites which reinforce the egregore and stuff like this. But there are then many things everybody does according also to the environment he lives in. There's a genius loci that dictates also a certain way of approach. I mean, I have people in the US that live in Oregon, which is a completely different environment than someone who lives in southern Brazil or other places. So where you live will also determine some of the ways in which you develop your spiritual practice. But it will be immediately recognizable to me how you do it and what you do if you do it in the correct way of the spiritual technology which works within that biocentric framework, you could say, for the lack of a better word. So basically, there needs to be intellectual understanding to a degree. Yeah, you need to understand what we're talking about. We need to have, of course, common vocabularies for us to be able to communicate cultic language, basically. So when I say, like, let's say a spiritual grammar or an esoteric grammar, it's language and it's ritual, it's practice, and it's the way transmissions are passed on. So there needs to be a recognizable framework. So I can teach someone something, and I know, like, if the lightning strikes me and I pass into the fields of the ancestors, someone must be able, or more people must be able, to carry on the work in a sense, because they understand the fundamental ways of the spiritual grammar and technology. So we always try to ensure that we have that in place, that initiations can be passed on, that we always have more than one or two people within the apostolic succession on the episcopal level, for example. And this could be another interesting podcast episode for us, talking about how we view, or we could view, let's say, the episcopal apostolic tradition, and why is it important, if you're not a monotheist, or if you're not but how this can be inverted and used, and what is interesting and what is not. So all of these things, I mean, we have a Gnostic church that basically teaches the Cosmic Gnosis, but it also can be taught in very different ways. So I could use very different models in which to teach the Cosmic Gnosis, as long as the model allows a framework in which these things can be communicated, right? So I could use, a Kabbalistic model, for example, using the Sephiroth and the Qliphoth or the shells, and trying to teach people that way, if that's the only thing they would understand. So in the end, I hope what the Black Pilgrimage does, the book does, is provide the fundamental cornerstones and point towards that skeleton which one must understand in order to be able to practically move into these spaces, and then provide thresholds and trapdoors through you resonate so well with this. I mean, as I said, your review of the book was just brilliant, and many people thought so. And to enter these thresholds, be able to find the trapdoors and go down the rabbit hole, and then maybe even use the practices, some of them maybe, or just try them out, but with an open mind. Not like spiritual practice is not for me, it's mumbo jumbo, it's theater. Is not, right? If you really go at it not in a Christian frame of mind, where prayer is, I don't know, just petitioning a higher power, but where prayers have a different effect, or are used in a different type of way, employed in a different type of way, and take root in a different type of way as well. So this is what it is in a nutshell. So a lot of motivational work, that is, so we're not entertainers, right? So when someone wants to study with us, for example, most of the people that are studying with us are not flaunting a lot of their stuff on Facebook, or they're not, showing altars and having everyday like weird pictures of gods and weird things. But these people are very usually successful in their own way, artists or architects or university professors, whatever. Different people from different ways of life, but everybody manages to have a life, and which they like to protect. So they are very actually subtle with their exposure to the wider world, in regards to their work, but mainly because their work to them is so sacred and important, right? It's not something that you do in order to become an occult influencer, or to gain kind of like favor with girls, or be super popular because you otherwise are not. And this is very important, that people are in it for the right reasons, not because they want to be attached to a cool sounding thing, but because they feel a calling to the work, like a Christian Orthodox priest would, or a Buddhist priest, a Buddhist master would, or a sannyasin would. So this is very important, because only then will you have the stamina to also last in periods where it's maybe frustrating, where you're hitting a brick wall, where you are thinking that you do not want this because your mind tells you differently. So at some point, you need to even put trust somewhere else. And so this kind of it's a process that's complex, and for some people it's harder than for others, and it's never as you imagine it. See, that's another thing. A lot of people go into esoteric traditions because they have a certain idea of what they want to find there, right? And what they think they should be finding there, or the applause and the recognition they should receive for their great efforts, right? And this is a typical Western, also consumerist attitude, right? I want to go in your group, so what are you going to provide? It's like, I want to go to your golf club, not the other one. What are you going to give me for my membership fees? So we don't even take membership fees, so it's even for free. So basically, you have to understand why you're in it, not because of course you have to feel a resonance with the current by maybe reading Black Pilgrimage, or by listening to our podcast, or by having some kind of impression of like, holy shit, something here there's a voice here that calls me deeper. And I'm going to start to look and see how that goes. And then we have a probationary period where, one can check each other out. And however, it's very hard for Westerners to have that capitalist idea of, gaining things that they want to have, this consumerist attitude. For the lack of a better word, right? So many people do have it, and they still look for it, but they are drowned in that noise of the occult environment. There's just so many people competing with courses. I make you a great magician, just take my online course. I will, there's a church of Hecate, there is a temple of Lilith, and there is watered down Buddhism, shortcut methods to initiation, no longer efforts. You don't need teachers. Teachers are fraud. Teachers want to exploit you. Teachers are, not necessary. You can do it by yourself, after your work, if you invest an hour a week. So these things abound, and they speak, of course, to our busy, pressured lives. So in the end, people have to understand, or maybe even decide, how strong is the calling. Of course, my work is the work of a specialist, of someone who has devoted his entire life to this type of work. However, not everyone has the time or even the necessity to do it to that level. But I believe you can be a student of the Cosmic Gnosis, and if you put in a serious amount of time that maybe some people put into their hobbies, rowing club, or whatever, polo, and what you English people do, cricket, then that will be enough. But it has to be serious. It has to be with a certain type of devotion to achieving a spiritual breakthrough, without already knowing or projecting what that should be looking like. But I tell students, and I tell people, the greatest success you can have is not that flash moment, where you're hoping to do the work, and at one point it makes boom and you are like super enlightened, but that gradual shift of awareness, that gradual feeling that things constantly fall into place for you without much effort, because your calibration is right. You're no longer an isolated subject that tries frantically to cull a safe universe out of the tragic world that we are confronted with, but by subtly shifting your center of gravity, you calibrate yourself in a way that things unconsciously get attracted to you. I had a conversation with my Theion partner Jessica a long time ago. Years ago, we were walking by my lake here where I live, Lake Starnberg, where King Ludwig II died. Who was also kind of a cosmic. So we walked in. She's like, "Oh, David, like she had a hard time at that moment." And she's like, "Oh, David, things seem to fall so effortless, always into place for you, And it's like, well, it's not because, of course, my life is always amazing, right? I got divorced, so obviously it didn't work out so well on that level. But it's the way you can kind of adapt to these situations. It's the way the way you move around in the world, and these things have the stress in a relationship, and even a divorce immediately for me brings new opportunities. The divorce was not a collapse of my life, but it was basically a type of freeing myself for new relationships. Not even relationships only with a girl or something, but a relationship in general.
Yeah.
So if I would have remained in my logocentric way of mind, I would have only felt it as a defeat, as a drama, as a tragedy, because a kid was involved as well. Thank God we didn't have a big, messy breakup or something like that. So I was lucky there too, although it was not also without its issues. But my way of responding to this was very different to this possessive, frustrated response that people would have if they think like, I own this woman, this relationship should be mine, it should have worked, we did everything we could and it fell apart, the world's unfair. On the contrary, I never felt like that. That didn't mean I didn't feel pain or didn't feel unhappiness at some points, right? But I always understood that if I never feel unhappiness or pain, I wouldn't know how it feels to feel great or to feel joy. Right? You only know what joy is because you know what unhappiness is, right? So we also need to always understand that one thing always brings its opposite. We can only feel an ecstasy because we have also understood and felt the opposite. We can only feel love when we feel its opposite. So, right? We need to be able to shift ourselves, and if we shift the gravity towards this relational state of being, I really truly believe that you calibrate yourself in a way that you're no longer a blockage to things. And I believe that if you calibrate yourself right, the things converge in a certain way as well. There is a magnetic kind of functioning here, I would call it, like you magnetically draw the things to you that you need at the time of your life that you're at. I've always felt like that, and I always felt in my life, even before I even could conceptualize, phrase anything cosmic. Even when I was 16 or younger or even a little older, I always felt that when I lived authentically, like following my instinct, rather than sometimes my brain in regards to, let's say, choices after I graduated from university, right? My brain and my parents and everyone around me told me to do this, and I didn't think that was right. And the moment I did it because everybody told me it was right, it was the right thing to do, I wasn't happy. And then I capped it after 2-3 years, and suddenly the things fell into place again.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be following the daimon. Your daimon has a certain configuration, and if you open yourself up and the daimon exerts its influence, it magnetically draws things to you organically. That doesn't mean, and immediately then the subjective mind comes back. I want to be rich. I want to be having lots of girls. I want to be this. I want to be that. I don't want to have pain in my back. I constantly have back pain and stuff like that. It's unfair, right? But I do. So, however, you don't get everything your consumerist subjective mind wants to have, but you have everything that's essentially necessary for you to live a very happy and content life. Because even when you get blowed, when you get a blow, you can absorb it differently. And like in a Nietzschean way, maybe, the downfall that you experience provides the opportunity to rise again, right? You can never have a triumph if you haven't been beaten down, right? If you just hang out at the summit, it becomes a boring life. So, however, it's not about like being always beaten down. You shouldn't even feel beaten down on that level. But I believe when you are calibrated correctly, no matter what happens, you will never experience it as an unfair, tragic blow of life. But even if it's hard, even if it's suffering, even if it means that there's another aspect there, you already feel the dawn of something else arising out of these ashes. You can already feel the phoenix, flapping its wings. This is how I feel about it, and this is how I experienced it. Like truly have, and other people I know have experiences this as well. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in it. I'm not a superstitious person. I don't come from a religious family. I don't have any need to live religiously. I went into it as a scholar, trying to really see if there's something out there more than I think we talked about it in our first podcast. There's something more, than we normally experience. That was that type of explorer's mind that I had, and a craving to see if there was something out there, because the trapdoors in other people's writings seduced me into nearly feeling something, that was behind that trapdoor, right? And I just needed to find that rabbit hole. So, and I'm still a very critical thinking person. So, right, the critical thinking doesn't go down the drain, this is a community of people that has been together for a long time, and everyone who comes and joins, feels so well within it. And we never have people that break away, because we do not have this competition of great systems that, there's a ladder and there's a king above, like David is the king and he rules the minions. It's none of that, right? None of that. There is no king, there is no nothing. There is, of course, people who initiate, there are initiators. There's, of course, maybe someone who has a leadership function on some level. But there are many different functions that people can take on, which are unique. So, it's that kind of, it's like in voodoo, where it's like a family tree, right? Where there are elders, there are initiators, and you can even surpass your initiator maybe one day, and the way you unfold the world, maybe you're more demonic in that purest sense. You can embody it better, because we probably all do it to a degree, and we all snap back sometimes into our, frustrated normal minds. That also. Nobody is this untouchable master that only dwells in demonic perfection. That's also ridiculous. It doesn't exist, right? It's always a mixture of things. But we can always reorientate. We can always recalibrate. We have the ways in which that is possible rather quickly. Or we have the people we can speak to, which can help us do it. So it's a life's journey. I come from a position of being an occultist and a spiritual master or initiator, if you so will, and that's my way of speaking from that type of position. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a writer. I'm not a writer of spiritual that writes about spiritual traditions. Black Pilgrimage and my work is basically an offering, a sacrificial offering from within a tradition, in the hopes that some people can resonate with it and enrich their own lives, or even some find a deeper motivation maybe to move into it, and then doors may open. So that's my interest. And that's the position I speak from. They're better philosophers, they're better writers, but I'm doing my best to do what I need to do from that perspective. Right? Yeah.
Is this your primary work at the moment? I mean, you've just finished the book up, but
my primary work is basically, of course, to earn money and to subsist in life. Is Theion Publishing. I'm a publisher basically. Sometimes, but of course, even there, you don't do it for the money. You do it for the love of producing books and caring for books and intellectual exploits. And even I love to publish books which may even, champion ideas which are completely opposite to my own. I love, even to release books on theurgy or something like this. I love well-written, intellectually pleasing treatises, even to basically, work my own ideas against it and stuff like that, as a great exercise. And I learn from things. So, Theion Publishing, but you don't do it for the money. I mean, it gives you enough money to live and stuff like that, but you don't get rich, obviously, right? But then I do. I never advertise this, but I also have some clients that I work with in regards to, voodoo, or when people need to think, I have some richer clients in New York or other places, and when they need to get stuff done, they call me, and I may work with them, for a job, and then I get stuff done for them, but that's very costly. So depending on the work they may want me to do, but this is something I only do word of mouth. There are a few people I work with, and that's also something I do and I charge for, obviously. While I also do a lot of communal work in regards to my position of priesthood for free. People that are within my community, obviously, right? As that is also part of my obligation as not only a priest of Haitian Vodou, where I deal with the Voodoo community and offer some of the things there, but also obviously my own esoteric community, my Cosmic Gnostic community. We don't charge anything. Everything is for free. My time is for free. We just want people to, respect that we invest all the time and then do their own work with dedication and focus, and not, waste our time, basically. Right? So, yeah, but so I'm basically not a writer. I don't write for income. I couldn't. If I would do that, I'll probably die. And would go hungry, right? I'm not a writer like Richard Gavin, who I like. Is a great writer. And people who can say like, well, I'm going to write a new book this year. I need to write a book or two each year, right? Because I need to live by it. And they have this routine. They have this also, I guess, these compartmentalized ways of constructing books and doing things. I admire that. It's great. And they have always new ideas. I can write well, but only if I get into the zone, right? Yeah. And a lot of things need to come together for me to get into the zone. So I guess I have to wait for the muses, to and for the stars to be right. So to write bigger things like a book. Mm-hmm. But I'm not stressed by it, because my main way of communicating is with my students in person or through discourses we have, and maybe a little writings here and there. I can write essays or articles quite easily if I want to. That's also okay. But I do not want to also be known as a writer. Mm-hmm. As an esoteric writer, or as an esoteric teacher who teaches through his books, because that is not what I think is ultimately working. I want to make clear to people that I believe that to have that real deep degree, so because people are always looking for the degree of spiritual deep experience as like a priest, right? Like a Buddhist priest or a deep initiate. although they're not willing to put the work in because they're consumers in the end. So I always want to make clear that I am a person who largely speaks to those people who feel a calling, who have that stamina, who still retain that kind of drive, that, maybe even demonic, pull, which forces them to do it. I always felt in my life something forced me to pursue it. I'm a very lazy person, actually, right? I always try to go the easy way. I never applied myself in school, only as much as I had to succeed, right? But I was never a nerd. I never felt ambition in everything I did. I'm a typical Gemini. My interests jump very quickly, but there was always that drive I had when it came to my spiritual life. Even interesting to me, because it's like, that's so unlike me, to be pushed deeper and deeper and further and further and further and never losing interest, right? I like you, I shifted here a little bit, sometimes there a little bit, went into Gnosis and went to do Michael Berdius work and this and Western esotericism. But the inner need to pursue and find the mystery, to find my place and to, unfold myself organically, was always there. And if you seek long enough, I guess the teacher will appear, or if you're open enough, if you can remove your ego from these kinds of things, it will happen. And I felt it did. And I try to pass this on as much as I can. And I admire Sufism. I've always had a very, very big interest in Sufism. I have a whole library here of Sufist books, and these teacher-student based traditions. I always had a very, very, very big interest in these, and also I felt the power in these. Although in my real life, outside of this, real life, right? It's actually the real life is that. The other is not the real life. But in everything is the real life. There is no spiritual life and this life apart. So it's all one, right? But in my profane life, let's say, I couldn't deal with teachers in school. I couldn't have anyone tell me what to do. I had a big problem with authority. I always felt that many people were too stupid to tell me what to do. Even in a job, I had jobs where my superiors were literally dumb. And I was like, I can't accept that this person gets more money than me and tells me what to do. It's like offensive. So, what other people didn't have a problem with that. I really had a problem with that, but I did feel the power of an initiator, is the need to submerge my very powerful ego in self-mutilation, in a sense, in self-sacrifice. I sacrificed my egocentric self, which was very popular. The reason I didn't do books for 10 years was because I felt that my success as the leader of Michael Bertius groups, and the success I had with Vodou Gnosis, which was a bestseller, and my publisher and other people telling me like, oh, you need to milk this, you're a good-looking young rock star type guy, you have charisma, you have personality, you're not afraid to speak, just go out and milk this. And I felt the seduction of it. You know what I mean? I felt how nice it is to have people telling you how great you are, girls telling you, you're the greatest and stuff like this. And I felt, oh, that's easy to achieve. I can keep going with that. But then, in those silent moments when I was just with myself, I said like, holy shit, this is not what I went into it. It's a spirituality for. And now spirituality has become that profane vehicle for me to be like, famous in the consumerist world, to have people applaud me. And I started to play to the audience in a sense, right? I tried to become a character. And I said like, wow, I've become a caricature of what I hoped I could become. And so I had to really self-sacrifice that type of David in order to move into my own and to be who I am now. And I always admired these Sufi masters, and even the greatest of the Sufi masters who surpassed their own masters, many, like in many ways. however, always referred their own success back to their masters and never lost that respect, never lost the humility, in which you could see really coming through, right? And I said, like, wow, this is so unlike the modern world, where we just try to use the next train and vehicle to assert ourselves over others, to have that marketplace success and acclaim. And even though we claim, and I love the people, the ones I love the most is those ones who profess themselves to be so humble, and I really don't like this success, I really don't like this applause, but by saying this, hoping that people say, like, no, you're the most humble, oh, you're the most, oh, that's the right attitude, and then they shine in their humility. It's just this whole marketplace, modern world even subtly manipulates you into acting a certain way, even if you're not aware of it. And that is why I think also teachers so important to sometimes correct your course, even if you don't want to see it, even if then your immediate reaction is like, he doesn't understand, it wasn't really like that, and he doesn't really know. So immediately, of course, you will have that reaction of, he's usually right, but he's not. And then you can find out they love teachers, but only as long as they kind of like, confirm what they already think about themselves, or, when they feel they can be a little bit they show a little bit humility because they have a teacher. But if the teacher says something that really goes against what they really want and believe at that point, then it becomes a problem. So anyways, you can see there's so many pitfalls.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we're never perfect. We oftentimes recoil, snap back, go tread the wrong way. And a good teacher, a good spiritual master, is also someone who respects that and has no problem with that. If you see the student is recoiling a little bit, or has a moment where he just needs to, like, oh no, I really don't think that, then you let them go for a while. It's fine. If they are rightly on the path, at one point they will probably return, right? Or you always open there for them if they want to come back, but you never try to keep them. You never try to convince a student to stay, a student of your work or anything, right? Evangelizing or convincing is never a good idea, because people need, like you said, the self-initiatory part is important, and to force someone into a certain set of experiences or beliefs, or it becomes bastardized and distorted if it becomes a forcefully intruding set of concepts which they can't unfold because they're rejected at a point, right? So that is why the work that we do is never based on have-tos, but it's only based on self-motivation. One is out there, and there are people who are, more active when it comes to being in touch. And then there's some people, who are maybe like hermits in a sense, they may not be in touch for like half a year because, they have a busy life, but I know they're still doing their stuff. And then when we reconnect a half year later, or when we have a meeting, sometimes I go to the States or we have meetings in Europe and stuff like that. So then I see them, and then I see, well, they have done the work, right? It's not that they come now for the entertainment and then, next year they're quiet again for doing nothing.
Yeah.
So because then they have to still provide a paper or do a ritual or something. So you can see everybody has their ways, everybody is their character, but there's certain things that need to be respected. You have to have a certain personality and a certain character, also a certain strong character to be ready to sacrifice some of your comfort or the easy ways, in favor of the deeper work, which then, however, I believe provides you with a life that's so much more ecstatic and so much more powerful and so much more empowering. Are we over?
No, we're fine. No. Well, there, I was going to say there we go. I mean, if I was just going to say, if people are interested in Cosmic Gnosis, Black Pilgrimage, I'll put links in the description below. And what's the best email for those that listen and want to?
There is. I will send you the link. We have a little a little website. It's called Cosmic Gnosis. .com, I guess it is, or primordialway.com. Another person administrates, and we just shifted it to a new server. So I think, however, these are the URLs, but I'll send them to you, so maybe you can put them under in case someone wants. Because there's some more, I guess, little snippets of writings and stuff like that there as well. So so people can read a little bit more stuff about.
I'll put the links for Theion as well. In the description below. But I think that's a good place to finish up. We've covered a lot.
Agree. It was great. My God, I loved it.
David, Beth, thanks again.
Thank you. It was